Imagine an island the size of France, a capital city with concentric rings of canals lined with bronze, tin, and orichalcum, a metal that doesn't exist in nature today, a fleet of 1,000 ships, an army of hundreds of thousands of warriors, and one day, in a single day and one terrible night, all of it sinks beneath the waves. Forever. Sounds like fantasy. But this story was told 2,400 years ago not by a storyteller, but by one of the most serious thinkers in human history, Plato. And ever since, people have searched for Atlantis underwater, in glaciers, in deserts, and even on the moon. Today we'll figure out what part of this story is myth, what part might be a distorted memory of a real catastrophe, and why archaeologists are still arguing about it 2,400 years later, and why this small philosophical parable about a made-up island still, 2.5 millennia on, remains one of the most discussed mysteries in human history, even though the answer, as we're about to see, is actually far better understood than it seems. The first thing worth knowing: Atlantis is not a legend passed down through generations, like Troy or Gilgamesh, whose traces can be found across dozens of independent sources from different cultures and eras. It's a literary account written by one specific author, the Athenian philosopher Plato, around 360 BCE, who lived at a very specific historical moment. Athens had just lost the grueling Peloponnesian War to Sparta. Democracy was in crisis, and Plato himself had been deeply shaken by the execution of his teacher Socrates. These political traumas are important context that explains why the philosopher turned to the theme of an ideal state and its downfall in the first place. Atlantis appears in only two of his dialogues, Timaeus and the unfinished Critias. In them, Plato describes how Egyptian priests supposedly told the Athenian statesman and poet Solon a story about a mighty state that existed 9,000 years before Solon, or, by another reading of the ancient Greek text, 900 years, a discrepancy that is itself an important detail philologists have debated for 2 centuries. Located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, a state that attacked Athens, was defeated by the ancient Athenians, and was then destroyed by an earthquake and a flood in a single day. Interestingly, Solon himself, according to Plato's version, supposedly planned to write an epic poem about it, but never got around to it. And the story reached later generations only through a chain of intermediaries, from Egyptian priests to Solon, from Solon to his relative Critias the Elder, and from him to the younger Critias, the character the dialogue is named after. In other words, even within Plato's own text, the story is presented as a retelling of a retelling of a retelling. Hardly how a serious historical document gets constructed. A key detail that's often forgotten: Plato used this story as a philosophical parable, not as a historical chronicle. In Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis is an example of an ideal, technologically and militarily powerful, but morally corrupted state, punished by the gods for its hubris and its departure from virtue. It's set up in direct contrast to the ideal Athens from another, far more extensive Plato dialogue, the Republic, where the philosopher describes in detail what a just political system should look like. In other words, what we're looking at is more of a political allegory and a moral lesson for Plato's contemporaries than a report from the scene. That it's also important that no other ancient Greek author before Plato mentions Atlantis at all. Not Homer in the Iliad or Odyssey, not Hesiod, not Herodotus, known as the father of history, who traveled across half the known world of his time, all the way to Egypt and Persia. describing in detail the most astonishing places, customs, and legends he encountered. If Egyptian priests really had told the Greeks such a story, it's strange that it passed by antiquity's most curious traveler. Plato's own student, Aristotle, a man who generally held his teacher in great respect, directly hinted in one surviving fragment that the island was invented by the one who created it and destroyed by the same one, openly acknowledging Atlantis as a literary device. So the first thing archaeology and philology establish with certainty is this: the only primary source is a philosopher's text, written as a multi-layered parable with political and moral undertones, not an account of real events recorded independently of Plato. If it's all so obvious from a philological standpoint, why do thousands of expeditions, books, and proofs keep appearing even now? And why hasn't the topic lost popularity for centuries? The answer lies in the nature of the story itself. Plato gave very specific, almost engineering-grade details: the island's exact dimensions, the number and width of its canals, the metal orichalcum, its geographic location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, even the irrigation system of its plain. Our brains subconsciously read specificity as a sign of truth. That's simply how human thinking works. A vague, hazy legend is hard to verify, but precise numbers and geographic coordinates practically beg to be checked, mapped, and found. This illusion of verifiability became the engine behind 2,000 years of searching. The earliest attempts to locate Atlantis date back to antiquity itself. Some authors tried to link it to real islands in the Atlantic, while others openly considered the story a fabrication. But the real modern boom didn't start in antiquity or even the Middle Ages. It started in the second half of the 19th century, when interest in archaeology surged thanks to sensational discoveries like Heinrich Schliemann's excavation of Troy and finds in Egypt. The public had grown used to the idea that myths sometimes turn out to be true. In 1882, American congressman, lawyer, and amateur writer Ignatius Donnelly capitalized on that mood and published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, claiming that Atlantis was the mother civilization of all humanity, and that it was from there that the Egyptians, the Maya, and other ancient peoples supposedly got their knowledge of pyramid building, astronomy, and metallurgy. Donnelly had no archaeological training whatsoever, and his argument rested mainly on surface-level similarities between flood myths across different cultures. Even so, the book became a bestseller, went through dozens of reprints, and essentially launched the entire modern Atlantis myth in the form we know it today. Occultism jumped in next, and this is what finally severed popular Atlantis from Plato's actual text. Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical movement, wrote Atlantis into her own spiritual cosmology in The Secret Doctrine, 1888, as the homeland of humanity's fourth root race, mythical Atlanteans with superhuman psychic abilities. In the 20th century, American psychic Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet for his trance readings, literally prophesied in the 1930s, 40s that sunken Atlantis would begin rising from the ocean floor near the Bimini Islands in the Bahamas sometime around 1968 to 1969. And, curiously, in 1968, a strange stone formation really was discovered near Bimini and immediately dubbed the Atlantis Road and proof of the prophecy. Although geologists later thoroughly explained these formations as natural limestone fractures, the sensation had already spread around the world and still resurfaces in headlines from time to time. So by the 20th century, An entire thick layer of esotericism and pseudoscience had attached itself to Atlantis, with no direct connection whatsoever to Plato's original source. This is critically important to understand. When someone online claims scientists are hiding the truth about Atlantis, they're usually not talking about Plato's text at all, but about these later mystical layers from the 19th to 20th centuries, which are themselves a separate, already modern mythology. And there's one final layer to this mythology: 20th to 21st century pop culture, which cemented in the public imagination the image of Atlantis as a magical underwater civilization with advanced technology, rather than a philosophical allegory. Disney's animated film Atlantis, The Lost Empire, 2001. Dozens of video games, TV shows, and comics about underwater civilizations, even the DC superhero Aquaman, whose homeland is Atlantis itself. All of this shapes an image that has far more in common with 20th century fantasy fiction than with a short text by an ancient Greek philosopher. It's no wonder that when viewers encounter the scientific version of Atlantis, it feels disappointingly modest compared to the spectacular image painted by film and games over the past 100 years. Now, on to serious science. Most archaeologists and geologists who are even willing to consider that a real event might lie behind Plato's myth point to one specific catastrophe. The volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, in the southern Aegean Sea, around 1600 BCE, though the exact dating is still a matter of scientific debate, which we'll come back to. Here are the facts science works with. Santorini before the catastrophe. The island of Thera was part of the Minoan civilization, Europe's first highly developed culture, centered on the nearby island of Crete, about 110 kilometers to the south. The Minoans, named that way after the legendary King Minos by later Greek historians, since the people's own name for themselves is unknown, built multi-story palaces of complex design with plumbing and even primitive sewage systems, far ahead of their neighbors technologically. They conducted active maritime trade across the Mediterranean. Minoan pottery has been found from Egypt to Spain, had their own writing system, which modern researchers call Linear A, and which, incidentally, remains undeciphered to this day, and produced fresco art of extraordinary quality, with vivid scenes of nature, sport, and religious ritual. On Santorini itself stood the thriving port city of Akrotiri, which archaeologists and journalists happily call the Minoan Pompeii, given the similarity of how it met its end, the catastrophe. The eruption of Thera is one of the most powerful in the last 10,000 years of Earth's history. On the Volcanic Explosivity Index, VI, it's rated at 6 to 7, roughly comparable to the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa in Indonesia, which was heard thousands of kilometers away and caused global climate effects, except Thera's eruption was, by various estimates, several times more powerful. The center of the island literally collapsed into the sea once the emptied magma chamber could no longer support the weight of rock above it, forming a caldera, a massive basin now submerged by the sea, which still gives modern Santorini its recognizable horseshoe shape. Photographed every year by millions of tourists, most of whom have no idea of the true scale of the catastrophe that created this landscape. The regional aftermath was catastrophic. Volcanic ash buried the island itself under several meters, and a tsunami, with waves estimated at anywhere from 12 to as much as 35 meters at their peak, according to different studies, struck the northern coast of Crete. Pyroclastic flows and pumice reached other Aegean islands as well. The ash cloud from the eruption likely affected the climate of the entire eastern Mediterranean for several years. Trees as far away as Ireland and California show anomalous growth rings from around the same period. Though the exact dating, as noted, remains disputed, radiocarbon analysis points to dates closer to 1620 to 1600 BCE, while traditional Egyptian chronology, cross-referenced with written sources, had previously pointed to around 1500 BCE, a 100-year gap that researchers are still trying to reconcile. The key archaeological evidence here: the city of Akrotiri was found preserved under a layer of ash, much like Pompeii in Italy. The volcanic ash perfectly preserved buildings, streets, furniture, and even wall frescoes in near pristine condition for thousands of years. But unlike Pompeii, almost no human remains or valuable jewelry were found at Akrotiri. This is a significant detail. It suggests residents likely managed an organized evacuation after feeling a series of warning earthquakes weeks or months before the final explosion, and took their most valuable possessions with them. Exactly where they fled remains its own open mystery, possibly to Crete, possibly to other islands, or the Greek mainland. But the Minoan civilization on Crete itself collapses sharply over the following decades. Palaces are destroyed or burned under circumstances that aren't fully understood, maritime trade contracts. And over the following century, Minoan culture gradually gives way to the more warlike Mycenaean Greek civilization. The very same Greeks who would later become the heroes of Homer's epics, and who, ironically, would themselves become part of the cultural memory that Plato drew on 2,000 years later. How do scientists even date an event this ancient? It's worth pausing for a moment on methodology, since it shows just how seriously science treats a question that popular culture often reduces to an ancient legend. Researchers use several independent methods at once. Radiocarbon analysis of charred olive branches found beneath the ash layer on Santorini itself. Dendrochronology, analyzing the growth rings of preserved tree samples from Ireland, Sweden, and even California, where anomalous frost rings indicate years of sudden climate cooling. An analysis of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, where layers of volcanic ash and sulfuric acid are recorded in the ice as distinct, datable layers, much like tree rings. The problem is that these independent methods yield somewhat different dates. Radiocarbon and ice core analysis point closer to 1600 to 1620 BCE, while Egyptian written chronology, cross-referenced with archaeological layers on Crete itself, has traditionally pointed to 1500 to 1450 BCE. This discrepancy, known among specialists as the Minoan chronology problem, remains unresolved and is still the subject of active scientific publications even in the 2020s now. The key question we're really here for: can this be connected to Plato's account? Arguments for an advanced maritime civilization with multi-story palaces, complex infrastructure, and high art genuinely resembles the technological and cultural level Plato describes for Atlantis. A sudden, enormous-scale natural catastrophe that virtually instantly destroys a thriving state directly matches Plato's plot of destruction in a single day and night. Chronologically, the eruption of Thera, around 1600 BCE, precedes the Trojan War and the Homeric era that later Greeks wrote about by several centuries. So the theory holds up within the broader timeline of Greek cultural memory. Egypt, the supposed source of the story in Plato's version, really did maintain active trade contacts with the Minoan world and could plausibly have preserved some records or oral traditions about a catastrophe of this scale. Arguments against. Worth stating honestly, since it's exactly this balance of arguments that makes the investigation credible to the viewer. Santorini and Crete aren't an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. They're in the Aegean Sea, in the middle of the Mediterranean, an entirely different geography, and any Greek or Egyptian of the time knew perfectly well the difference between these regions. The dimensions Plato gives, an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, are orders of magnitude larger than the real scale of Santorini or even the whole of Crete. Plato's chronology, 9,000 years before Solon, is an order of magnitude larger than the real date of the eruption, even assuming a tenfold translation error, 900 instead of 9,000 years. A gap with the real eruption date still remains. So the most popular hypothesis, and the one with the strongest backing among serious scientists, doesn't explain Atlantis literally, detail for detail, but rather a possible source of inspiration and raw material for the parable, a real, genuinely massive catastrophe, memories of which passed through Egyptian priests, trade contacts, and an oral tradition carried across generations for more than 1,000 years, reached Plato already heavily distorted and dramatically exaggerated, with different geography, a different scale, and different numbers, adjusted to fit the author's philosophical purpose. The Santorini hypothesis isn't the only one, and it isn't even the last serious theory on this list. Researchers have proposed at least a dozen alternative versions over the past 150 years. Let's go through the most interesting ones, from fully scientific to openly fringe. Helike, less well known but fascinating. In 373 BC, literally during young Plato's lifetime, the real Greek city of Helike on the Peloponnese was destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in a single night and sank beneath the Gulf of Corinth. Plato's contemporaries wrote about this event, including the historian Xenophon, whom the philosophers certainly knew personally. Helike was searched for and couldn't be found for more than 2,000 years, until in 2001 a Greek-American expedition led by Dora Katsonopoula discovered the remains of the city, not underwater in the Gulf, as long assumed, but buried under a layer of sediment on land, deposited there by flooding from the Salinas River. It's entirely possible that when creating Atlantis, the philosopher layered this fresh, well-documented catastrophe on top of the Egyptian parable, which would explain the detail of a single day and night, a detail absent from any other known legend of the period. Eberhard Zanger's theory, Atlantis is Troy. Swiss archaeologist Eberhard Zanger proposed in the 1990s that Plato was describing not a separate civilization, but a distorted, geographically flipped version of the Trojan War. Under this theory, Atlantis is Troy itself, and its opponents are the Mycenaean Greeks, that is, Plato's Athens. The argument: both stories involve a maritime state at war with a mainland civilization that ultimately falls. Zanger even suggested the confusion arose from Greek translations of Egyptian records that mixed up geographic reference points. The theory remains marginal among classical philologists, but it's notable for offering an explanation without needing to search for a lost island at all. Cyprus and Crete from a different angle. Some researchers, including geologist Robert Sarmast, proposed in the 2000s looking for Atlantis not in the Aegean but further south in the Mediterranean, near Cyprus or in the submerged continental shelf area between Sicily and Tunisia. The evidence here is weaker than the Santorini case. There are no comparable archaeological finds at the level of Akrotiri, just hypotheses based on bathymetric, seafloor terrain, maps, the literal Atlantic Ocean idea. Some insist Plato really meant the Atlantic in the modern sense of the word, and search for Atlantis near the Azores or even the Bahamas. The most famous example is the same Bimini Road mentioned earlier, an underwater formation near the Bahamas photographed in 1968 by researcher J. Manson Valentine, who immediately declared it man-made masonry. Geologists later conducted detailed analysis of the stone slabs and demonstrated that they are natural limestone beach rock formations, which crack into nearly rectangular blocks under tidal action, a well-documented process seen in other parts of the world where nobody is searching for Atlantis. Pseudoarchaeology and internet theories. This is its own separate league. Atlantis under the Antarctic ice, a hypothesis popularized by certain fringe authors in the 1990s, with zero geological support. The continent has been covered in ice for millions of years, long before any human civilization existed. Atlantis in the Sahara. Based on satellite images of the Rikat structure's ring formations in Mauritania, which really do look like concentric circles from space and therefore regularly resurface in viral videos. In reality, this is a geological formation. The erosion of a symmetrical dome of sedimentary rock hundreds of millions of years old, long predating humans, confirmed by geologists through drill samples back in the 2000s. And, of course, popular documentary shows from pseudoscience-oriented channels that routinely mix real archaeological facts with outright fabrications to boost ratings and monetization. These do the most to shape the public's mistaken impression that scientists are hiding something. The main marker that separates science from fringe claims here is simple and consistent across all the theories above. Serious researchers, whether Santorini proponents or supporters of the Helike or Zanger theories, always speak the language of probability, a possible source of inspiration. It's not out of the question that arguments for and against. Pseudoarchaeology, by contrast, speaks the language of certainty. Finally proven, scientists are hiding it. 100% proof. The moment you hear that second kind of phrasing, it's a red flag, no matter how striking the satellite images look. Archaeology's honest answer goes like this. Atlantis, as the specific state literally described by Plato, with its exact dimensions, ring-shaped canals, and army of hundreds of thousands of warriors, most likely never existed. It's a philosopher's literary construction, assembled from elements of real catastrophes, perhaps Santorini's, perhaps Helikes, perhaps both at once, and, likely, real cultures, Egyptian and Minoan, that Plato and his educated contemporaries were well aware of through trade, travel, and oral tradition. But that doesn't mean the story is worthless or that 2.5 millennia of attention to it were wasted. Quite the opposite. It achieved something extraordinarily rare for a philosophical text. It has lived for 2,400 years, survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, the Age of Exploration, and the Space Age. And it still drives human curiosity, funds real archaeological expeditions on Santorini and in Greece, and forces us to ask the right, remarkably modern questions about how civilizations actually fall, not from the mythical wrath of gods punishing hubris, but for entirely real reasons: volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, slow-moving climate change, and their own political and economic mistakes accumulating for years before the catastrophe hits. And in that sense, the best answer to what happened to Atlantis isn't a set of coordinates on a map that someone has finally decoded. It's the realization that even the mightiest, most advanced civilization of its time can vanish in practically a single night when forces of nature on this scale turn against it. The Minoans proved that, for real, on the record, with no myths or psychic prophecies required. Tellingly, archaeology isn't standing still. New excavations continue every year on Santorini and Crete, and new analytical methods are being applied, from DNA analysis of ancient grain to 3D scanning of the Akrotiri ruins. And it's entirely possible that the next decade will bring new details that either draw Plato's parable and the Santorini catastrophe more precisely together, or finally separate them for good. Unlike the myths about it, the science of Atlantis isn't a finished, frozen story. It's a process still unfolding right now. So, coming back to our opening hook, an island the size of France, ring-shaped canals, orichalcum, an army of hundreds of thousands. This most likely never existed in the form Plato described 2,500 years ago. But a good 100-plus kilometers from where 19th to 20th century romantics and occultists unsuccessfully searched for the classic Atlantis, beneath the modern tourist island of Santorini, there really is a city preserved in ash, a genuinely advanced, wealthy, technologically sophisticated civilization that really did exist, and it really did vanish, practically instantly by historical standards, within a matter of years after one of the most powerful explosions in Europe's history. Maybe the real Atlantis doesn't need a treasure hunt on the ocean floor with sonar and underwater drones. It's already been excavated, thoroughly studied, and is open to visitors. It just goes by a different name and has nothing to do with orichalcum or the Pillars of Hercules. So what do you think? Was Plato writing a purely philosophical parable, or did he, however distorted by time, pass down a real memory of a real catastrophe? Let me know in the comments which version you find most convincing, Santorini, Helike, or maybe you don't think there's any point in searching for a prototype at all. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe. There are plenty more What Happened To stories coming on this channel. See you in the next investigation.